And for more information, there's my email and there's our website if you want more information on MyLab. Split to the next one. So just to give you a really brief rundown of what MyLab is. So MyLab is HEP funded. So that's the Higher Education Participation Partnership Program. And the university receives money so that we can actually go out and deliver our programs to the community, to schools, and also on USC campus. So there's the three areas of MyLab there. So I look after the secondary programs, which is 4 of my community, which are out in the community doing things with robotics, women in STEM, parent and carer workshops, and my events, which are all the activities that happen at USC campus in relation to STEM. So that's what we look after. We look after the STEM programs for USC under the MyLab banner. We have all our resources are free and available online through that MyLab website. We also have Science Unplugged as well, and there's also professional development on that website as well. One of the programs that we do have is a program written by Kathryn. It's called My Brain. It's aimed at curriculum for Year 9. We have delivered it in a couple of schools now, and it's been really well received. So we were just talking before, if you came online earlier, that it's been delivered to Year 9s, but it's also been delivered into Year 10 for their psychology and biology classes. It's actually a really good program and has creative arts at the end, so they actually build their own brain. It's a really good program. All those resources are online and they're all free to download. So you might ask, why my community and Queensland Mental Health? That's why. Those 2 simple statements that are from the Queensland Mental Health website fit with us exactly. So that's why we are able to put these events on and encourage people to attend to get that information. And that's me done. So I'll hand over now to Kathryn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mandy. Okay, so hello everyone. So for the rest of this hour, we are going to be covering the 4 topics in the top dark blue ribbon on this slide. So we're going to be talking about the human brain. We're going to be looking at its structure and function. And then we're going to have a look at how that structure and function helps us learn. Look at learning how we learn, so meta-learning. We're going to look at the toxic impact of stress on our ability to learn. And then finally, we're going to cover something called cognitive reserve. So before I launch into to talking about the science, I'm just going to introduce myself. Because every time I've given a talk with Mandy, bless her, I get too excited about the science, then I forget to tell you all who I am. And at the end, she's always shaking her head. So I created this slide mainly to prompt my own memory. But actually, it was really helpful in sort of creating or helping me create the story that I wanted to tell you guys tonight. So that's me down the bottom. So up until 2018, I'd spent about a decade in research. So I'm an MR physicist, and I was using MRI machines to investigate a wide range of pathologies. So I started out investigating cardiac function in premature babies. And then I moved into the dementia space, so looking at and investigating the efficacies of interventions to slow the decline in dementia and mild cognitive impairment. And then I moved up to USC to set up and then coordinate the imaging research facilities at USC. And so there I was moved into the mental health space. And I spent a lot of time on different research projects under the wide and large umbrella of mental health research. And about that time, I started working quite closely with the STEM office at USC. So STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths. And I was creating a load of different activities and courses to engage kids in STEM. And then I kind of realized that that was the most fun part of my week. And so in 2020, I decided to make a sidestep out of research, and I joined the MyLab team. And that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years. So I create science activities based on current research that kids can access that fits into the secondary curriculum. And Around 2020, I was also teaching in the engineering part of the department, so helping run all the practicals for the engineering undergraduates. So it was in the Department of Engineering that my brain first was sort of born. So engineering is a careers degree, which means that they actually have to do practical tasks throughout their degree so that they can hit the ground running and be engineers when they leave university. So it's nothing like physics, where we sort of spent 4 years contemplating adding more dimensions to our multiverse model and things like that. They actually have to do useful things. And so this lovely lady in the picture is Professor Helen Fairweather, and she spent so much time trying to find new and exciting real-world activities that the students could do as part of their course to gain their qualifications. And the first one that I was involved with helping her run was something called GovHack. Now, this is it's not important to remember this, but just for context, GovHack is something that's put on every year by the government, and different departments in the government will put forward a problem that they are facing in the up and coming year. And then of the weekend of GovHack, they will release a load of data around that problem. And then they open it up to anyone in Australia, and you can log on online, you can find like-minded people and form a group, and then you can pick a problem that you want to tackle, and then you get to play with the data and try and come up with some solutions for that problem. And so when we first posed this to the engineering students, we were met with utter terror and horror. And we got so many complaints, and reading between the lines of their complaints, it was clear that they were very much in a fixed mindset. They were really anxious, and they'd sort of let their stress and anxiety hijack their brain. And they couldn't really see what a great opportunity this was going to be. The fact that they could work on real world problems, and that they could network and meet potential colleagues and employers. And so what we did was we put aside a whole hour lecture, and I spent an hour with one of their engineering lectures just teaching them about the neuroscience of learning and how stress can impact our ability to learn, but also why learning is really important for our brain throughout our life. And this idea that we kind of wanted to shift them from this fixed mindset to this growth mindset, which is something that I know kids in school these days kind of hear so much about these buzzwords that they're probably a bit tired of it. But certainly when I was at school, this was not really a concept that we were taught about. And it's not really surprising that they were in this fixed mindset, because we all go through, or the majority of us go through standardized testing school. So there's a curriculum, and our teachers teach us what we need to learn. They tell us what we're going to learn, and then pretty much it's assumed that part of what we learn is going to be on a test. And so we're taught to a sort of testing system, and we know that structure, and it's quite a safe structure. Now, when we were asking them to approach GovHack, we obviously couldn't tell them what they were going to do. We couldn't tell them the problems that the government was going to release for that weekend. We couldn't tell them anything about the data or how they were going to solve it. It was completely up to them. They were faced with this problem that they had to apply their knowledge and their current skill set to problem solve and work on this data. So it's new territory. So it wasn't surprising that they kind of panicked. So anyway, this kind of first lecture was the inception of my brain, I guess. And the other thing that I sort of wanted to show them, which was why I really cared about them trying to transition from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, wasn't because I did want them to do well at GovHack, but more importantly, I wanted them just to enjoy learning and approach learning throughout their lives and challenge their brain and challenge themselves to learn. Because as we will see, as we move through this hour, that's really, really important to build up your cognitive reserve, which is what we'll talk about at the end of this talk. So I'm going to zoom in on this graph in a minute, or this model, but this is a model that we all lived and died by when I was doing research in dementia. And this was released in the Lancet a couple of years ago. Now I've got, I referenced a couple of studies throughout this talk. And at the end, what I'll do is I will copy all of the links to the different papers in the chat so that you guys can access them, so that you can copy and paste them. And so this model shows risk factors for dementia. Now, if we zoom in on here, you can see that there's a little percentages here for the different risk factors. So those risk factors, sorry, represent the percentage of cases that would be eliminated if we got rid of these risk factors. So you can see a lot of my work when I was in the dementia research space was focused on the later life risk factors. So we were looking at how does physical activity improve or reduce cognitive decline. But if we look up here in early life, you can see that less education contributes to about 8% of all dementia cases. So it's really important that we keep learning throughout our life, because we have the ability to change and reduce this risk factor. And you can see here in the dark grey and the light grey, they're non-modifiable risk factors, and they make up about 65%. So that's just, unfortunately, we're always going to be stuck with that. But then the other 35% are potentially modifiable risk factors. So we could, in theory, eliminate 35% of all dementia cases by looking at and eradicating these risk factors. So that was kind of the message that I wanted to get across to these guys, is that, sorry guys, is that it's really important to keep challenging your brain and keep learning, even though it can be quite daunting at times. All right, so let's get into the actual science. So the things that we're going to cover tonight are some of the scientific topics that, or they're all actually in the My Brain. So this is what the kids will also learn about when they do the Mind Brain course. So if we look on the top row here, we've got a number of different brains. So we've got a codfish brain, an alligator, a frog, and a goose. And then on the bottom row, you can see we've got, we sort of move into the mammals. So we've got a cat, a monkey, and a human. And they all look quite different. But what you'll notice from the color coding is that they've all got the same parts. They've all got the same components of our brain. They're all just different sizes and shapes. And scientists can actually tell a lot about the environment that an animal has evolved into to survive by the shape and the size of the different brain components. And what you'll notice with the mammals, or mammals that have very complex social lives, is that they have a huge yellow part of their brain, and this is the forebrain. And so much so that our forebrain has actually folded in on itself. So it's not smooth like the goose or the frog. Our brain is folded in on itself, so we've got even more tissue packed into our skull. And that's essentially more computing power. And so we have, through evolution, for some reason, and this is a really interesting question that people are still trying to answer fully, is why has putting everything into the basket of developing a big brain been advantageous over when you look at the backdrop of all the things that we've actually lost. So if you think about human beings, we're all neurodevelopmentally born very premature. Most animals can walk within a couple of hours or days, but we actually take years. And you'd think at first glance that actually that would be extremely disadvantageous when you're surviving in the wild and then having to pass on your genes so that adaptation could then evolve. But as we'll see as we'll move through this talk, that actually compute power has just won out. Okay, so if we look at the forebrain in more detail, this is a human brain. So just to orientate ourselves, on the left-hand side here, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but this pinky bit, that would be the front of our head, so our forehead here. And then we're going over to the top of the brain where the pink and the purple stripes are. And then the back of our head would be where that green section is. So this pink bit at the front is known as the frontal lobe. And this is the computational part, or the control panel of our brain. So this controls important cognitive skills such as emotional expression, reasoning, problem solving, and judgment. So it's kind of the control center of our personality and our ability to communicate. Now, this sort of yellowy orangey section here is known as the temporal lobe. And this is involved in creating and preserving both conscious and long-term memories. And then if we move up to the top here, so these two stripes are the motor cortex. So this part of the brain is really interesting because we actually have a map of our body mapped onto this part of the cortex. So when you close your eyes, you know exactly where all parts of your body are. So you don't actually, if you want to move around and say move your hand to your mouth, you don't have to look at your hand to try and coordinate that because our body has been mapped onto this part of the brain already. And so this part of the brain is involved in planning and controlling and executing voluntary movements.
I have a question, Kathryn.
Yes. Yeah.
What are some of the non-modifiable risk factors other than genetics?
The genetics. That's a good. Well, genetics is a huge part of it. We are still trying to pull that apart as to how much that actually underpins your risk factor for dementia. But I mean, genetics is the building blocks of how our brain develops and then is structured. So we'll see when we move through this talk, everyone's got the underlying, we all develop a brain and it looks very similar. And then that's how that develops and how that structure forms is down to our genetics, so the code in our cells that tells our cells how to build our brain. And then on top of that, so that's the kind of non-modifiable part. And then on top of that, we've got a bit of flexibility and a bit of padding, and how our brain functions and communicates is somewhat down to our life experiences that we have. But the non-modifiable, that's a very good question. We're still trying to work that out. We're still trying to. That 65% number has basically come from thousands of studies looking at dementia patients and looking at their lives and taking surveys and doing autopsies at the end of their lives, and trying to explain the factors that go into or that correlate with dementia. So we are still trying to unpick that 65%. Sorry, I think I've got this 52nd round of COVID that's sweeping through the UK at the moment. Was there another question, Mandy? Or shall I? Hello, Mandy? Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so then we've got the parietal lobe, and that interprets the information or processes our sensory information that we receive from the outside world, mainly relating to touch, taste, and temperature. And then finally, we've got the occipital lobe, and this interprets the information that we receive from our eyes. So it basically interprets how we see the world, and it's responsible for our visual perception, including color, form, and motion, and depth, and things like that. Now, it's important, this is a very simplistic view of the brain and how it's sort of divided up. And it's important to realize, though, that these brain regions don't work in isolation. So it's a bit like, I guess, a research group with a load of different researchers who have their specialities and their expertise, but they still all need to work together and communicate to be able to solve the bigger problem, which in this case is sort of moving through life. So they work as a network, or within a network, and that idea of our mind or our brain's network is something we're going to keep coming back to as we go through this talk. So what does that forebrain buy us? Well, it buys us something that psychologists call executive functions. And so these are higher level cognitive skills that we use to control and coordinate other cognitive abilities and behaviours. And they are vital for us to navigate our daily lives, and they're vital for our overall mental well-being. So things like cognitive flexibility, so that's flexible thinking, so adjusting our behaviour and our actions to unexpected changes. And then we've got inhibitory control, so that's being able to control our emotions and keep our feelings in check, and impulse control, so thinking before we act. And then we've got working memory, so being able to retain and recall key information. And then If we can use working memory and cognitive flexibility together, we can also plan and prioritize and organize our lives. And then we've got self-monitoring, so we are self-aware and we can assess how we're doing at any given moment. And then we've got task initiation, so taking action and actually starting a task. Now, these are all really, really difficult things to master, and we start to kind of learn how to master them through adolescence, and then well into early adulthood, and actually, well, throughout our lives. And they're also really, really hard to maintain. So on a good day, we'll be able to do all of this really well. But as you'll know yourselves, when you feel a bit stressed or ill or tired, you will start to lose the ability to carry out these higher order functions. I know, for instance, when I get ill, I find my memory gets really bad and I get really unorganized quite quickly. They're also the thing that we lose first. So they're the last thing that we develop, but they're also, particularly if any of you guys have had the unfortune to have a loved one who's suffered from dementia, you will have noticed that they start to regress back to childlike behaviour, and that's because the executive functions are something that we lose first at the end of their life, at the end of our lives, and that's because they're really expensive from an energy point of view. They take up a lot of energy for us to carry out these functions. Okay, so let's now have a look at our brain and the structure underneath that allows us to carry out these functions. So this is an MRI image of my own brain that I took at USC a good few years ago now. And it's orientated the same way as the diagram of the brain that we were looking at earlier. So on the left, we've got my forehead, and then just cast out of the image underneath that would be my nose. And then at the top, that's the top of my head. And then coming around to the right, that's the back of my head there. And you'll notice that essentially the brain tissue is just made up of dark grey and light grey pixels, so tissue. And the dark grey is called grey matter. And that's the computing processing part of the brain. So where I guess the thinking is done. And then the lighter grey is the white matter. And this is the sort of neurocircuitry of the brain. So this is basically the wiring that connects the grey matter regions to each other so that they can communicate with each other. All right. So our brain is the home of our minds, and our minds are constantly controlling the flow of information. So our memories, our thoughts, emotion, and our imagination to interpret the surrounding environment so that we can react accordingly. So this flow of information can be thought of as a social network. So instead of friends sending messages between each other via social media, information is sent between different regions of the brain along neurons, so along the white matter, the neurocircuitry of the brain. And our mind's network relies on the underlying structure and neurochemical makeup of our brain to function successfully. So in fact, a effective mind network allows us all to be cognitively and emotionally and socially healthy. Now, in mental health disorders, such as depression and anxiety, we often see a disruption to our mind's network and the way that it communicates. And this change to the underlying structure and biochemical makeup of our brains can affect the way that we cope with normal stresses of life, and it can affect our productivity and our overall well-being. And therefore, neuroscientists and researchers wanting to understand mental health disorders and how we can all stay mentally healthy seek to examine this network. So that's quite a large focus of my brain, is looking at how we analyse and interpret this brain network. And if we can understand how our brain's structure and chemical makeup lead to healthy function, then we can start to understand disorders. Now, I have to put this slide in because it's obviously Mental Health Week, and it's really important to just acknowledge the disease burden of mental health. And it was actually a bit depressing because I created this original slide about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and I actually had to modify these numbers. So everything seems to have increased. So 4 years ago, it was about 1 in 5 Australians will experience a mental illness throughout their lifetime, but it's now increased to 2 in 5. Mental health accounts for 27% of total years lost to disability, and it's still the second leading cause of disability worldwide. And unfortunately, cases of or instances of anxiety has increased from 14 to 16.8% just over the last 3 to 4 years. So it is obviously a huge field, and there is a lot of focus on trying to understand mental health disease and disorders. Once again, I've got all of these stats from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, so I will put this link in the chat and you guys can look at that afterwards if you wish. Okay, so the field of mental health research is absolutely massive, and there are loads of different ways that people study mental health. But one of the ways that we can investigate the brain is through MRI, is through neuro-imaging. So that was mainly where I came in and was a large part of my work for sort of 3 years. And MRI is actually a really versatile tool. So I'm not going to go into how it works because that would take ages. But essentially, we use magnetic fields and radio waves to create a map of the water content of different tissues in our body, and in this case, the brain. But we can also use MRI to look at how water moves through tissues, and that can tell us a lot about the structure of the tissue. So this is just an example here down at the bottom. So like the slide that I showed you before of my brain, I've taken a 3D image of someone's brain. So it's not just one slice, we're actually moving through the whole brain from one ear to the other. And this image is made up of 3D pixels known as a voxel. And we obviously know the size of the voxel, and then we can segment out the different regions and tissues of the brain, and then we can work out the size and the shape of someone's individual brain. And you can imagine then that if we did that for a whole cohort of people, we could start to compare the shape and the size of people's brains, around just the shape actually, between health and disease. But we can also do longitudinal studies where we can see how someone's or different brain regions might diminish over time or change size or shape with a disorder. Then we can also look at the white matter. So as I said, we can use MRI to look at how water moves through tissue. And because white matter is like cabling, water flows along the direction of the cables. And therefore, if we can map that motion of water, we can map the cabling of our brain. So the structural connectivity of our network. And then this is the same brain as the structural image, but I've just segmented out all of the white matter here. And it really does look like sort of fiber optics. Okay, and then finally, another imaging technique with MRI is functional MRI. So with functional MRI, what we're doing is we're mapping the influx of blood to different regions of the brain, with the idea that if a brain region is active, it needs more oxygen, and therefore blood will be directed to that part of the brain. And then this image here, this is still fantastic. I mean, this was released in 2014, but I just love this video by Andrew Zaleski et al. But it's they scanned 100 people in the scanner and just told them to rest, and then they compiled all, and they scanned them for about 10 minutes, and then they made a video of the brain activation over those 10 minutes. And what you'll see is, if I can just hang on a minute, if we move that over. There we go. So different brain regions activate together. So the darker the red, the more activation you're getting in that region. And what you'll see is that regions turn off and on together. And so you can actually visualize the flow of information around our brain's network. And regions aren't just lighting up in isolation, they're activating together, and so that's thought to be that those regions are communicating together via a network. Okay. So this idea that the brain is a network is extremely handy because we've actually organised our own external lives, like the internal organisation of our brain. We naturally form networks. We're all part of a social network, whether that be online or in the real world. And a lot of our transport systems and our infrastructure are our networks. And so that means we've got a whole branch of mathematics just to study networks. And we've actually gone back and then applied this branch of mathematics to our brain's network to try and work out what's going on. Okay, so this is going to be a really simplistic view of this branch of mathematics, which is known as graph theory. But essentially what we do is we count the number of nodes. So that's the blue circles in this very simplistic graph. And they represent the brain regions. So in this brain, we've got 7 nodes. And then we also count the communication pathways between the nodes, known as edges of our graph. And the number of edges are also 7 in this graph. And then once we've got those numbers, we can start to look at the connectivity. We can put a number to the connectivity of our network. And we do this by very simply counting how many communication pathways are between one brain region or one node and every other node. So if we take this top blue brain region, you'll see that it's one pathway to the next, to the right brain region. And then to this brain region in the middle here, it's now 2 pathways. And we add them all up and then we find the average. And the lower that number is, the more connected that brain is, because it means that then there are very small jumps between each brain region, so they're well connected to the next node. And then we can also look at network efficiency. And I mean, there are many ways to do this, but if we're doing the most simple version, we just look at 1 over the average pathway. So 1 over the average number of edges I have to travel to get to every single brain region or node within my brain. And as part of my brain, we actually get the kids to calculate different network efficiencies so they can start to perform graph theory. Okay, so now we've put a number to something, we can start to analyze different brain networks in health and disease. Yes, so we can also identify hubs as well. So just like Sydney Airport, for instance, is a really important transport hub. Our brain actually has regions that are also really important hubs of the brain, where a lot of networks seem to pass through those particular brain regions. Okay, so this is just an example of graph theory being used in action. I think this is still probably one of my favorite dementia research papers out there, even though it was published in 2013. And so what they did was they looked at functional connectivity between long distance pathways. So that's how well do brain regions that are separated via the hemisphere, so different sides of the brain, how well do they communicate as dementia progresses? And so what we've got is NC is for normal controls, and then we've got MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment, and then we've got mild Alzheimer's disease, and then we've got severe Alzheimer's disease. And what you can see is that the number of long distance regions that communicate with each other decrease as the disease progresses. And so the brain itself becomes more isolated as the disease progresses. So the brain kind of starts to mirror how the person's outward behaviour, how we can observe the person's outward behaviours, how they become more isolated in themselves as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about learning and how we can use this, our ability to record and analyse our brain's network to learn how we learn. So what I've done here is I've taken an MRI image of my brain, so it was a 3D image, and I've just segmented out the frontal lobe in red, and then we've got so remember the frontal lobe is executive functioning, so it's the kind of control panel of our brain. And then in yellow, we've got the hippocampus, which is the learning and memory center. And then in light blue, we've got the amygdala, which is the emotional processing part of our brain. Now, don't worry about this sort of big hole in my frontal lobe, but that's just because I've had to cut through it because the frontal lobe wraps around, obviously, and then you wouldn't be able to see the other 2 subcortical structures here. So I've just kind of sliced it open a little bit. Okay, so now I want you guys to imagine that we are in a maths class and the teacher has told us we're going to start a new topic and we are going to learn how to perform and carry out long division. So what happens first is we have a huge emotional response to this piece of information. We know we're going to be learning something new, and we're probably a little bit nervous and apprehensive about whether or not we'll be able to do that. So our amygdala sends messages to our frontal lobe to say that we're having an emotional response to something. And our frontal lobe then communicates back to our amygdala as it makes a threat assessment. So it's working out, is this emotional response important? Do I need to listen to this? Am I in any immediate danger? And we'll obviously work out that we're not. We're sat in a lovely classroom, so we're all fine. And then it will send a message back to the amygdala to try and shut off that emotional response so that it can then busy itself actually working out and trying to problem solve the problem that's been put in front of us. So this is our inhibitory control in action. So then once we've turned off or dampened the noise from our amygdala, our frontal lobe can start to carry out executive processes to try and work on the problem that the teachers put in front of us, to work out how to carry out long division. And then as we're doing this and problem solving, we will call on our hippocampus. So remember, that's the memory center of our brain. So this is the working memory part of the executive function loop. So we will be recalling on any piece of information that's useful to us. So we've obviously learned previously how numbers work. We know basic division of, 2 goes into 4 twice and all the rest of it. And we'll be recalling on all of that information to try and help us learn this new skill. And as we're recalling old memories, we will be laying down new memories as well, or building on those old memories with the new information that we're learning. And then as we're doing this, our hippocampus will be communicating with our amygdala and assigning a positive or negative association with this task. So this is really important because this is very energy expensive. Learning new things takes a lot of brain power and a lot of calories. So at rest, your brain takes about 20% of all of the energy or food, the calories from the food that you consume a day. So when you're then having to challenge your brain and learn new things, that's obviously very energy expensive. And so we need to know, or our brain needs to know, am I enjoying this? Is this a benefit to me? And if so, then if you enjoy it, you're more likely to repeat that task. If not, you're more likely to then avoid similar situations in the future. So as we're learning, we're laying down these emotional positive and negative associations with what we're learning. And this actually affects the way that we remember in the future this experience. And then this is happening all the time. So it doesn't just happen once. These brain regions are communicating with each other via a network all the time, and we get a feedback loop as we're learning. And then if we repeat this over and over again, so if our teacher gives us loads of long division problems to tackle over the weekend for homework, we do it over and over again, we will be activating this particular network over and over again. And what we'll see is we start to strengthen this network that we've activated to carry out this particular task. And so the more brain activation we get, what we'll see is that this will strengthen, and then over time, carrying out this task will become easier and easier. And so we know this from real life. It's sort of a neuroscience version of practice makes perfect. And that you have to do something over and over again and apply your existing knowledge to become a master of a skill that you're trying to learn. So this idea that your brain will change and strengthen its network to support improved performance in a task or a challenge that you're trying to carry out is known as neuroplasticity. And this is really important because this sort of answers our first question right back when we were talking about the human brain and why is it beneficial to have a lot of compute power when in the backdrop of what we've lost. And that's because our brain is then able to evolve on a micro time scale, so within someone's lifetime. And there doesn't seem to be a limit to the amount of things that the human brain can learn. So I don't think there's a human that's ever existed that's got to the limit of how many things a human can learn. So it's almost unending. And that's the real sort of benefit to having a big forebrain. Okay, so this is a study putting this into action. So this study, it's a real fun one actually, because most studies in mental health are kind of a bit doom and gloom, and we kind of look at healthy controls, if there is such a thing, and then we look at a disease group. But this has actually taken some outliers in society in a really fun way. So this looks at memory athletes. So these are the people that go to competitions and they memorize huge long lists of things, like the pi to like the 1000th decimal place or something. And they will recall those numbers seamlessly, effortlessly. And so this paper took them and they did a load of MRI scanning to look at the functional connectivity of their brains. And then they took a load of normal people like you and I who have normal memories, and they compared the two. And they found that in the memory athletes, there was increased functional connectivity between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe predominantly. And that kind of makes sense because the temporal lobe, as we know, is the memory center of our brain, and the frontal lobe is the control panel. So if you increase that, if you strengthen those communication pathways, then it, in theory, it will support improved memory. And then what they did was they took the normal controls, and I think they gave them either 6 weeks or 2 months of memory training, the exact same memory training that the memory athletes would do before a competition. And then they scanned them after the memory training. And they found that these differences had completely disappeared. So the normal controls then had actually strengthened these exact same communication pathways in their brain. And that kind of proves that anyone has the potential to change and to strengthen these brain networks and to be a memory athlete. And that applies to other skills as well. So there isn't a sort of limit to what we can learn, and we all have the ability to evolve our brain within our lifetime. And in fact, that's kind of what the brain is designed to do. It wants to be able to learn new things, and so that it can adapt and modify and become more efficient at carrying out and solving problems and using our executive functions. Okay, so what happens in stress? So here on the right, I've just got a very simplistic graph of stress versus performance level. So our brain has a kind of love-hate relationship with stress. We need a little bit of stress to motivate ourselves. So for instance, initially when Mandy said, "Oh, do you want to do this talk?" She didn't have a date for me. So I just said, yeah, this is fine. And she didn't have an actual date for me. So I didn't do anything. I had no motivation to start preparing this talk because there was no stress. There was no deadline. And then she came back to me with this date. And then that actually prompted me to put some slides together and think about what I was going to say. And so you need stress to initiate a task. The problem is that if it gets too much stress, then that can hijack your brain and disable, I guess, your brain, and your performance will drop. And you almost become paralyzed and can't actually start or to use any of your executive functions. So now imagine we are in the same maths class and we didn't really listen or do any of our homework with long division, and we've got a test tomorrow. So the stress factor in this is that we've got a deadline and a test, and we've also got all of these perceived horrible negative consequences of failing the test. Now what's happening is we're having a massive emotional response to this situation because we're stressed. So the amygdala is almost shouting at our frontal lobe, and this diminishes our frontal lobe's ability to turn off this message. And so our inhibitory control is diminished or weakened. And then this has a knock-on effect, because although our brain has an endless ability to learn new things, we can only do that sort of consecutively. So the idea of multitasking is a bit of a myth. We only have a certain amount of compute power for any one time. And so if we're using quite a lot of our frontal lobe to try and process this massive emotional response, then we're not going to have the same amount of computational power to actually deal with the problem and try and learn how to do long division. And so our whole feedback loop gets diminished. So the way our ability to recall information, so our working memory, then gets impaired. And this is really interesting because in times of stress, when you recall a memory and you put it into your conscious brain and you think about it, every time you do that, you are slightly modifying that memory. And so it all depends on your emotion at the time that you're remembering, and you'll lay down new memories depending on how you're feeling at the time. And studies have been shown when they look at eyewitnesses that actually they're a really terrible account of what happened. They're not very good evidence at all in court, and that's because it is impossible to to remember accurately what's happening around you when you're in a very stressful situation. And so then the knock-on effect of this is also that we are assigning a negative association to this learning process. So we're more likely in the future oh, sorry guys, we're more likely in the future to try and steer away from maths and steer away from doing this long multiplication, because we've learned that this is quite a stressful situation to be in. And then the overall knock-on effect is our feedback loop also diminishes. And so we'll get to the test the next morning and we'll probably do really, really poorly.
Quick question, Kathryn.
Yes.
If the hippocampus assigns a negative association to an activity, why would one repeat that same activity despite the negative association? I think you just
that's a really good question, and that's kind of like how your brain has I mean, that's I guess your brain's way of protecting you from doing things that are harmful or that you don't like, and that's kind of I guess that's part of the downside of this neuroplasticity. Actually, this is what this slide talks about. So thank you. You're one step ahead of me. Is that neuroplasticity can be very beneficial, obviously, because if we have good positive experiences and we're challenging our brain in a good way, we can strengthen those connections to improve performance. But at the same time, if you're in a period of prolonged stress, that will also change your communication pathways in a negative way. And then you will try and steer away from that particular task. And you often hear people using the test scenario again. You often hear people say that they don't like tests and they don't perform well in tests. And this is kind of outside the scope of this talk, but it's something that I know Mandy and I have been really, it's taken up quite a lot of our time thinking about this problem, because when you're learning, standardized testing is actually one of the worst ways of being able to test someone's ability. But it's also, if you're teaching to a test, you're almost always in that stressful loop where learning is just not fun, it's stressful. And then you're setting your brain networks up for the future to kind of associate learning as being quite, and testing as being quite a stressful thing, which is not good. Yes, so this is just leading on from that. This is a study looking at severe anxiety disorder and controls. And so they found again that there was network changes, functional network changes in the brain, and predominantly between the frontal lobe and the amygdala, so the emotional processing part of the brain. And so I guess this is just an example of how neuroplasticity can work the other way. Okay.
Just have another quick one, Kathryn.
Yes.
Can continued exposure to stress reduce this expected knock-on effect, i.e. can we train to reduce this impact on taking computing power?
I see what you mean. So if you're, like training yourself to deal with stressful situations, that's a very good question. Actually, again, this leads on to this slide, cognitive reserve. So this is cognitive reserve, is the idea that people develop a reserve of thinking abilities during their lives, and that then this protects them against cognitive losses that can occur through injury or aging or disease. And stress, and chronic stress is, in this case, is termed as a disorder or disease. And so it's the idea that you can create brain padding to protect yourself from this. Yeah, so you could, but I wouldn't suggest putting yourself in extreme stressful situations over and over again. There are better ways to do this, as we will see. We will see in a minute, because as there's a huge body of work out there that shows that stress is extremely toxic to your brain. And the idea with cognitive reserve is that we build up this reserve of thinking abilities, doing good things, and challenging our brain in a good way, so that when we then do get to a stressful part of our lives, which we inevitably all will, and probably multiple times in our lives, we might have a better outcome. Okay, so activities that engage your brain, such as learning a new language or a new instrument, or having really high levels of social interaction, or routinely carrying out exercise, are really good ways of building your cognitive reserve, so building your brain padding. And then that means that you reduce the risk of developing clinical syndrome to the underlying pathology in your brain. So that means that cognitive reserve can't stop you from getting ill, or it can't stop you from getting injured or developing a disorder or even dementia, but it can pad your brain and protect you from losing your cognitive abilities due to the underlying pathology. So cognitive reserve is a protective mechanism that supports sustained function following damage to your physical brain associated with age, injury, or disease. So the goal is to build up a greater reserve capacity, and then we're less likely to demonstrate behavioural or cognitive disturbances associated with disease. All right, so just to kind of run through that, I made this graph myself, so I'm sorry, it's really rubbish, but it's just a model to explain this principle. And I've used dementia as an example purely because the disease progression of dementia is quite linear, and therefore it's easy to plot on a 2D graph. But this, so if you know anything about mental health disorders, people can yo-yo between times of good and poor mental health, so it's a bit harder to get this idea across. But the concept of cognitive reserve is very similar. It's just we're going to be talking about dementia in this case. Okay, so along the x-axis we've got years, and then we've got cognitive ability along the y, and we're going to imagine that we've got two identical people, and they start out together. They're born on the same day, and they progress through adolescence and to adulthood. And we're going to label one as having a high cognitive reserve and one as having a low cognitive reserve. So the low cognitive reserve reaches adulthood and then very extremely decides that they're not going to challenge their brain anymore. They're not going to learn anything else. And the high cognitive reserve person seeks to constantly challenge and challenge themselves and learn new things. So their cognitive ability kind of progresses like this throughout their life. And then they'll get to a point where they both develop dementia. So the pathology of dementia begins in their brain, and that will be invisible at the beginning. Changes to the structure and the chemical makeup of their brain will start, but there are cognitive abilities you won't notice any change. And they'll progress a bit more to the point where the load of the pathology will become too much and they will start to decline. Their cognitive abilities will start to decline. And then at some point in time, their cognitive abilities will decline so much that they will get a diagnosis of dementia. The first thing you'll notice is that the blue person, high cognitive reserve person, declines a lot more quickly, but we have extended the portion of their life where they are healthy. So we can't stop the development of these diseases yet. There's no kind of magic cure, And we can't extend our lives with any of these interventions. But what we can do is we can extend the proportion of our life where we're healthy, and that kind of should be the goal of everyone, I guess. And so that's basically the concept of cognitive reserve, and that's why there is a lot of focus at the moment in research about how we go about best building our cognitive reserve through our life. So this was just this is a final paper I'm going to talk about. We're almost at the end now, so I think I'm a little bit over time, but anyway. So this was a paper where we looked at different training, so cognitive and resistance exercise training in people who were diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. And they did 6 months of either cognitive or resistance training or both, or we had a control group who didn't do anything. And then we imaged their brain and we looked at the atrophy rate of their hippocampus, so how quickly their hippocampus was degenerating. So the hippocampus is obviously the memory center of the brain, and that degenerates first in, as you would expect, because a classic symptom of dementia is that people's memories start to go. And what we found was, it's quite a complicated image, but if we just ignore everything else and just look at the graphs, 2 graphs on the bottom here with all the color in it. The first one you can see, so this is left hippocampal volume. So it's 100% when we first scanned it. And then we scanned them after training at 6 months and then at 2 years. And you can see that everyone who did the training, the rate at which their hippocampal shrivels or shrinks is significantly decreased compared to the guys who didn't do any training. And what we found was that the people who did the exercise actually had a larger reserve that protect against damage to their hippocampus. And this also corresponded to their cognitive test scores as well. We're not the only ones who have done this. There's been a huge amount of work that has looked at the protective effect of exercise on brain health. So just to sum up, I always find this hard to talk about this slide because you kind of get into the space of sounding like a lifestyle guru, because it is all sort of cliche and obvious, but the way to look after your brain is building cognitive reserve. And the way that we can do this is by looking after our heart, being physically active, following a healthy diet, enjoying an active social life, and challenging our brain, so constantly learning new things. So again, and it does sound cliche that it's a very much a use it or lose it scenario. And that is it. So those are all the useful links of all the studies that I've talked about. So I will, if I stop sharing at the end of this, I'll put it in the chat at the very end. And if you guys want, you can then download those links. Yeah, that's it. Any questions?
I do have a question. So, can the rate of cognitive decline of high cognitive reserve individuals be slowed after diagnosis with continued development processes such as social interaction, exercise, and a higher level cognitive activity?
That's a really good question. So what we found is that obviously, as you've seen there from my terrible graph, their rate of decline is a lot quicker, because what we can't do is extend someone's life. What we found is that, unfortunately, that endpoint is fixed. And so if you then work in the space of that's a fixed time point, and you increase the healthy portion of your life, then the more healthy years you get, the quicker decline you're going to get at the end. And that's because your brain has got a huge amount of cognitive reserve, and it's just managing to keep its head above the water, I guess, with all of these, carrying out your executive functions and navigating through your busy, complex lives. But it will eventually get to a point where the pathology load and the structural damage to your brain is just too much, and then you will decline rapidly. But so the goal is obviously to keep active and keep building on your cognitive reserve throughout your lifetime. So usually if someone's got a lot of cognitive reserve, by definition, they would already be doing that. They'll already be very active socially and physically, and constantly challenging themselves. So if they're already in that mindset of seeking out new things. And there has been a lot of work around different interventions. Exercise is one. I know there's a lot of work in the mindfulness space, which has proved to be really, really effective. But we're still, this research is still in its infancy, so we still need to see the limits, I guess, or the potential of building someone's cognitive reserve. Is there a limit that we just won't be able to reach? And I don't know the answer to that, but the brain is almost limitless, so maybe not, but I'm not, I just don't know. I was going to say something else then, but it's totally gone from my brain.
I've got a couple more questions coming through.
Yeah.
Kathryn, have you observed hippocampal atrophy in subjects with MDD?
MDD. So I haven't personally worked on MDD. However, in my literature reviews, I have seen that there are structural changes to MDD, to the hippocampus in MDD patients. And functional changes as well. So they tend to have a reduced hippocampus, and the functional connectivity between the hippocampus. So the hippocampus, as you probably guess, is a really important hub of the brain, and a lot of it's in sync and it communicates with a lot of other regions of the brain. And there is aberrant functional connectivity between the hippocampus and the frontal lobe, and also a network to do with, it's called the default mode network. I'm getting a bit extended now, but the default mode network seems to switch on when we are just daydreaming or ruminating about things, about what we're going to be doing in the future. And we need this network. This is quite a healthy network to have. It kind of allows your brain to regulate itself and just process and plan what you're going to do next, and for you to sort of daydream and work out your aspirations and things, and process your emotions with your activities that you're planning, which is really important to work out what you want to do and your goals in life. But the problem is in MDD, they found that it's really hard to switch this default mode network off, and so often patients will be stuck. And you can imagine they're ruminating and processing their emotions too much, and so it's hard for them to switch that network off and then get into using another network and initiating tasks and things, and then that has a knock-on effect that has changed we don't know whether the structural changes happen first and that's caused the functional change. We don't know if it's a causal or a causal relationship, or which way that causal relationship goes. But we do know that, there are structural and functional changes to the hippocampus.
And I have another one. Thank you, Kathryn. I know you are on very limited time here. So are the learning activities that increase cognitive reserves not also stresses?
So everything that we do is a stressor. So if you remember back to that graph, we need stress to motivate ourselves, and by definition, attempting something new and having to use your problem-solving skills to learn something is quite stressful. But what we need to do is, if we think about neuroplasticity, when we're activating our brain to problem solve or to start a new challenge, we're not only strengthening that network that allows us to perform that particular task, but we're strengthening the network that we need to utilize our executive functions. So the more we learn, the better we become at learning. And your executive functions can be seen as transferable skills. And so if you then build on these transferable skills and build up your ability to use them, then you get better, I guess, at approaching challenging situations. But you do need a little bit of stress to actually do anything. And that's how all animals work. Stress sort of keeps us moving and keeps us alive, because if there was no stress, we would all just not get out of bed in the morning. Yeah. Any more questions?
I'll unmute myself. Yeah, we got time for one more. I've heard that meditation practices such as mindfulness and heartfulness can increase the grey and white matter of the brain. Is this building cognitive reserve?
Increases the grey and white matter of the brain. So I don't know of any intervention where you can increase your brain tissue and increase your brain size. What we can do is we can stop atrophy, which is the loss of brain cells, and we can improve the communication networks between the brain regions. So we can strengthen your white matter connections between that connect the grey regions. We can't like increase our brain size, but then brain size doesn't actually correspond to cognitive ability at all. So if you imagine we're born, and then we are, we're given the brain size that we have, and then as we get through adolescence and adulthood, we're that's the structure of our brain is sort of set. We can't make our brain any bigger through cognitive activities, but what we can do is slow that atrophy. And when we slow that atrophy, that will build on our cognitive reserve, because you're building that brain padding, if you like, to the impact of pathology. Does that answer your question? So if an activity can slow the decline, whether that's cognitive decline or structural changes to the brain, then that the idea is that is building your cognitive and your brain reserve.
Well, that's all the questions we have.
Excellent.
And we're right on time. Well done, Kathryn.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, and my son has literally just woken up. Yes.
Yay. So thank you everyone for coming. We've got a lot of thank yous in the chat there for you, Kathryn, and thank you for taking those questions and answering them.
Thank you. It was fantastic.
And I'll get back to everyone and send you the link for the video, which I can do shortly. I'm just reading that. Yep, lots of thank yous. Thank you. That was awesome. Very interesting webinar. So that's great feedback. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. I will just try and paste these links in so that people can access these papers, or maybe should we send them out